The morning Louise Wallace rode into Colton Creek, she had 43 cents in her coat pocket, a bruise yellowing along her left jaw that she'd stopped explaining to people, and a name she hadn't used in 7 years. Not her real name, anyway. Not the name that belonged to her by birth, the name her mother had sewn into the collar of her Sunday dress when Louise was 6 years old so nobody could steal it. That name, Wallace, she kept close and secret, like a coal in cupped hands, warm and hers alone. The name on the papers that followed her, the name that could be spoken in a court of law and have weight enough to drag her back, that name was Greer. Louise Greer. Wife of one Harlan Greer of Abilene, Kansas, married in the spring of 1876 when she was 19 years old and not yet wise enough to read a man's eyes properly. It was 1883 now, and she was 26, and she had learned to read eyes very well. Colton Creek was a small town in the hill country of central Texas, the kind of place that didn't appear on most maps and didn't seem to want to. A single main road ran through it like a thread pulled through cloth, buildings leaning slightly toward each other the way people do in cold weather. There was a general store, a livery, a church with a cracked bell, a saloon called the Dusty Spur that she noted and filed away in the part of her mind that tracked exits, and a boarding house with a sign that read Mrs. Clara Potts' clean rooms, honest rates. She tied her horse, a clay-colored mare she'd bought cheap in San Antonio and named Nobody's, at the post outside the boarding house and went in. Mrs. Potts was a wide, warm woman with silver hair pinned up tight and reading spectacles on a chain around her neck. She looked at Louise the way experienced women look at other women who have been traveling hard, not with pity, but with recognition. "Room's $1.50 a week, Mrs. Potts said. "Breakfast included. I do not allow men past the parlor and I do not ask questions." Louise set $2 on the counter. "I'll take 2 weeks up front." She was given the room at the end of the hall on the second floor, the one with the window that looked out over the backyard and the pasture beyond, so she could see anyone coming from that direction. She always chose rooms with 2 sightlines if she could. Old habit. She slept that first night so deeply that when she woke at dawn and reached automatically for the knife under her pillow, she spent 3 full seconds not knowing what town she was in. Then she heard a rooster somewhere beyond the pasture, and the creak of the boarding house settling in the early heat, and she pressed her hand flat to the mattress and breathed. "Colton Creek, Texas. You're all right." She found work inside 3 days, which was faster than most places. The general store, Hatch's Mercantile, needed someone to manage the books and take stock of the dry goods inventory because Emmett Hatch, the owner, was a generous and disorganized man who was better at selling than counting. Louise could do both. She had a head for numbers and a handwriting that people consistently described as the cleanest they'd ever seen, and Emmett Hatch hired her on the spot for $1 a week plus a small commission on the accounts she brought current. She told him her name was Louise Wallace. Nobody questioned it. In 1883, a woman alone in a small Texas town was not an unusual thing, and people in places like Colton Creek tended to take you as you presented yourself. They had their own histories to keep quiet about. The first time she saw Roscoe Shepard, he was standing in the road outside her store arguing with a mule. Not loudly, not with the exasperated shouting she might have expected. He was talking to the animal in a low, reasonable voice, the way you might talk to a stubborn colleague whose point of view you respected but disagreed with, while the mule stood absolutely immovable in the center of the road with a load of fence posts across its back. The mule's name, she would later learn, was Senator. "I understand your position," Roscoe was saying, reaching up to scratch behind Senator's ear, "but the posts need to go to the north pasture before sundown, and you have to walk there regardless. So the question is whether you walk there cooperating or walk there having made your feelings known. Either way, you walk." Senator considered this. Then he walked. Louise watched from the doorway of the Mercantile, and she was smiling before she knew it, the kind of smile that happens without permission. Roscoe Shepard was 31 years old, which she would not learn until later. He stood about 6 feet in height with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than any deliberate effort, broad shoulders, lean everywhere else, hands that were weathered and careful looking. He had dark brown hair that he kept short under a well-used hat, and a jaw that needed shaving about every day and a half by the look of things. His eyes, when he finally glanced over and noticed her standing in the doorway, were the particular shade of gray-green that changes with the light, and they held a quality she had taught herself to measure quickly in men. They were not calculating, not immediately looking for advantage, just observant and slightly amused at himself for having been caught talking philosophy to a mule in the public road. He touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, morning," she said, and went back inside. He came in later that same afternoon to pick up a supply order that Emmett had been holding for him: flour, salt, 2 spools of heavy wire, and a bottle of turpentine. Louise pulled the order, tallied it up, and told him the total without looking up from the ledger. $3.11. "That's right," he said, with mild surprise, as if he'd been ready to check her arithmetic and found nothing to check. She looked up then. He was looking at the ledger with something like genuine appreciation, which was not a response she usually got from men looking at bookkeeping. "You new here?" he asked. "Relatively," she said. "I'm Roscoe Shepard. I have a place about 4 miles east of town, down by Creeley Creek." "Louise Wallace," she said. "I manage the accounts for Mr. Hatch." He nodded. He paid the $3.11 exactly, which she also noted, because men who paid exact amounts without fumbling or complaining had usually handled their own money for a long time without someone else to do it for them. He gathered his supplies, thanked her, and left. She watched him load his wagon with the efficient, unhurried movements of someone who had done the same task many hundreds of times, and then she turned back to her ledger and made herself stop watching. That was the 1st of October. The autumn in Central Texas that year was the kind that makes you believe the world might have been designed thoughtfully. The heat broke cleanly in mid-October, and the evenings turned cool and smelled of cedar and dried grass, and the wood smoke beginning to rise from chimneys up and down the main road. Louise had been in towns before that felt like way stations, temporary arrangements, places to rest before moving again. Colton Creek, somehow, did not feel that way. It felt like a place that had been there a long time and intended to keep being there, which was both a comfort and a danger, because she had learned not to get attached to permanence. She saw Roscoe Shepard about once a week when he came in for supplies. He was always courteous, always exact with his money, and consistently paid attention in a way that was quiet rather than intrusive. He noticed, for instance, that she had reorganized the dry goods section by weight and type rather than the previous system, which had been primarily alphabetical and made no practical sense, and he mentioned it once briefly as a thing he'd noticed and approved of. He never leaned on the counter. He never lingered past what his business required. He asked her no personal questions. She noticed all of this. She was a woman who had spent 7 years noticing everything, and what she noticed about Roscoe Shepard was that he was pointedly decent, in a way that was effortful and deliberate rather than natural, which meant he was probably trying to be something better than whatever he'd been or whatever he'd seen. She recognized that, too. He had a ranch hand named Felix Oropsa, a compact and cheerful Mexican man of about 40 who came in sometimes when Roscoe couldn't make the trip himself. And Felix had the quality of people who are universally liked. He greeted everyone by name, laughed easily, and had a way of making whatever errand he was running feel like a social visit. It was Felix who, without appearing to, gave Louise most of what she eventually came to know about Roscoe. "He runs about 200 head of cattle on 400 acres, Felix told her one afternoon while she was wrapping up a parcel of coffee and sugar. "Got the land 6 years ago, bought it fair from old Creeley's widow after the old man passed. He puts up fence that actually holds. His cattle don't stray into anyone else's pasture. He pays me and the other 2 boys every month on time, Felix paused, as if considering whether this next part was appropriate to share. "He is a quiet man, not cold, just quiet." "Most men who are worth anything are quiet," Louise said. Felix grinned. "I will tell him you said so." "Please don't," she said, and her tone was firm enough that he didn't. But she thought about it, the way she thought about most things in the long evenings at the boarding house after Mrs. Potts had served supper and the other boarders had gone to their rooms. She sat at the small table by her window with the papers she worked on and thought about Roscoe Shepard, and then she thought about Harlan Greer, and then she put the thought of Harlan firmly away and went back to her papers, the way you bank a fire before you go to sleep. Harlan Greer was a fact. He was not a ghost, not a memory, not something she could afford to treat as either of those things. He was a man in Abilene who held a marriage certificate with her name on it. And under the laws of the state of Kansas and the territories and most of the United States, that piece of paper made him her husband in a way that no amount of running could unmake. She had tried early on to find a lawyer who would help her seek a legal dissolution, but the first lawyer had told her it couldn't be done on the grounds she offered, that Harlan was not a good man was not, legally speaking, sufficient. And the second had sent word to Harlan that she'd been asking around, which was how she'd found out the second time that she needed to run. After that, she'd stopped trying legal routes and started trying geography instead. She had been in Colorado for 2 years, in New Mexico territory for 18 months, in western Texas near El Paso for almost a year before a man she'd trusted told someone she shouldn't have trusted, and she'd packed her 2 bags and saddled nobodies at 3 in the morning and ridden east without knowing specifically where she was going. San Antonio, then north, then here. 7 years, 3 territories, 2 states, and at least 11 towns. She kept a careful internal accounting of all of it because it helped her not to feel afraid of it. She was afraid of it, of course. She was afraid every single day. But fear managed carefully can keep you alive and moving, and she had learned to use it the way you use a compass, not to mark where you are, but to tell you which direction is dangerous. The first crack in her careful distance from Roscoe Shepard happened in November, on a Wednesday afternoon when the sky had gone the color of pewter and the wind had picked up mean and cold off the hills. She was leaving the mercantile at closing time, had her coat buttoned to the throat and her bag on her arm, and she walked out into the road to find that 2 men from one of the larger ranches to the north, the Draper outfit, whose hands had a reputation for being disagreeable when they'd been drinking, which was most evenings, were positioned just outside the door in a way that was clearly intentional. They weren't doing anything specific. They were just there, taking up space in the particular way that men sometimes did when they wanted to communicate that they could do something if they chose. Louise had dealt with this kind of thing before. She kept her chin level and her pace even and started walking past them, and the taller one stepped slightly to the side in a way that required her to either stop or make contact with his shoulder. She was calculating the angle and her options when a voice came from her left. Ed, Roscoe's voice, flat without heat but with a quality underneath it like iron under cloth. "Move." The tall man, Ed, turned. Roscoe was standing by his wagon on the other side of the road, one hand on Senator's bridle, looking at Ed with no particular expression, except the one that means a thing is going to happen one way or another, and the only question is whether the person on the receiving end chooses to make it complicated. Ed moved. He and his companion walked off down the road without looking back, and she couldn't tell if it was because they were afraid of Roscoe or simply because they couldn't think of a reason not to. She turned to Roscoe. "I could have handled that." "I know," he said, not dismissive, not apologetic, just a statement of what he actually believed. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you anyway," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and touched his hat and climbed up onto his wagon seat. She stood there in the cold wind and watched him drive away down the road toward the east, and something shifted in her chest like furniture being moved to make room for something. She did not like it. She also didn't put it back. After that, things progressed the way things progress in small towns, when two people are both paying attention, but neither is willing to be the first to say so slowly, by degrees, through conversations that grew gradually longer and more honest without either of them seeming to notice they were getting longer and more honest. He came in on a Tuesday in late November and asked her, while she was tallying his order, if she'd heard there was going to be a Christmas social at the church in December, because Emmett Hatch was helping to organize it and he thought she might not have been told yet. She said she hadn't been told. He said he hoped she'd go, because Mrs. Potts made a fruitcake every year for the social that was by some distance the finest thing he'd eaten on a recurring basis. She said that was a specific endorsement. He said he was a specific person. She did go to the social, and Roscoe Shepard was there with Felix and the other two ranch hands, Darnell Pike and a young man of about 19 named Sam, and he crossed the room to stand beside her at the refreshment table with the ease of someone who had decided to do a thing and saw no reason to be awkward about it. They talked for 2 hours. She found out that he was from eastern Tennessee, had come west at 22 because the opportunities were better out here, and the land his family had farmed had been sold off in pieces until there wasn't enough left to support a future. He'd worked as a trail hand for 3 years, then a foreman, then had saved enough to put down money on the Creeley Creek property. He'd been on his own land for 6 years. He found out that she was from Missouri, that she'd had schooling until she was 17, that she'd come west because she'd married and her husband's people were here, and then things had changed. She did not say more than that, and he did not ask. What she noticed, more than what he said, was how he listened. He gave her his full attention in the way that costs something, because it requires you to actually stop thinking about yourself while the other person is talking, and most people can't do that for long. Roscoe Shepard appeared to be able to do it indefinitely. He watched her face when she spoke, not in the appraising way of men who are trying to determine something about you, but in the interested way of people who find you worth understanding. She was in serious trouble, and she knew it. She walked home to the boarding house through the cold, clear December night with her breath making ghosts in front of her and her heart doing something complicated that she hadn't asked it to do. She sat on the edge of her bed with her coat still on and looked at the knife she kept under her pillow. She had run from one man who had a legal claim on her name. She had run carefully and painfully and at great cost, and she was still running in the sense that she had never stopped looking over her shoulder. She did not have the right to hand herself to another man's keeping, not until she was free of the first, and she was not free. She might never be free. That was the truth of it. She put the knife back under the pillow. She took off her coat. She lay in the dark and told herself she would be sensible. December became January. 1884 arrived cold and dry over the hill country. Louise kept her resolution of sensibility for approximately 2 weeks, which was as long as she could manage it before the weight of deliberately avoiding something you want became heavier than the risk of approaching it. It was a Saturday afternoon in mid-January when Roscoe came into the mercantile an hour before closing, not with a supply order this time, but with his hat in his hands, which was unusual enough that Emmett Hatch glanced up from the back room and then found somewhere else to be with the practiced tact of a man who recognized a situation. "Miss Wallace," Roscoe said. "Mr. Shepard. I was thinking about asking if you'd like to come out and see the property sometime. The creek's something in winter. Ice forms on the edges of it in a way I've never seen anywhere else. But I realize that's an unusual thing to ask, and I didn't want to ask it without telling you first that my intentions are straightforward and respectful. And if the answer is no, the next time I come in for supplies it will be exactly the same as the time before, and you have my word on that." Louise looked at him for a long time. He stood there with his hat and didn't look away and didn't elaborate, which she respected enormously. "I appreciate the straightforwardness," she said. "I would like to come and see the property, but I need to tell you something first." He waited. "I'm not free," she said. "Not the way a person ought to be. There are complications in my situation that I can't resolve quickly and may not be able to resolve at all. I'm telling you that clearly because you've been decent to me, and you deserve to know what you're dealing with before you make any decision about it." He considered this the way he considered everything, quietly, thoroughly, without visible distress. "I understand complications," he said. "I'm not asking for anything you're not in a position to give. I'm asking if you'd like to see the creek in January." She put on her coat. "I'll get my hat." The ride out to the Shepard place took about 40 minutes on horseback, and they rode side by side on the road east of town, while the sky was that particular flat white of winter in Texas, neither threatening rain nor offering sun. He told her about the property as they rode the north pasture, where the grass came back best in spring, the stand of live oak on the east side that provided shade for the cattle in summer, the problem section of fence on the south boundary that he'd rebuilt twice and was planning to rebuild a third time with better posts. She listened and asked questions because she was genuinely interested, and because she found that talking with Roscoe Shepard had the quality of talking with someone who answered what you actually asked rather than what he thought you ought to want to know. The creek was everything he had said it was. Creeley Creek in January ran quiet and dark between its banks, and along the edges where the current was slow, the ice had formed in sheets and fans and delicate points that caught what light there was and held it. She stood on the bank for several minutes in silence, and he stood beside her with several inches of cold air between them, and neither of them spoke. "It's beautiful," she said finally. "Every winter," he said. "I haven't gotten used to it." She looked at him, and he was looking at the ice on the water with an expression she could only describe as grateful, the look of a man who knew he had something worth having and hadn't forgotten to notice it. "You should have gotten used to it by now," she said. "6 winters." "I think some things you just don't get used to," he said. "I think that's actually the point of them." She did not tell him, then, about Harlan. She hadn't told anyone in Colton Creek about Harlan, not even Mrs. Potts, who knew something was complicated but was true to her own policy of not asking. But riding back to town in the late afternoon, with the cold pinking her cheeks and Roscoe riding beside her telling her the names he'd given various landmarks on his property, Widow's Rock, the lopsided hill, Three Sisters Draw, she felt the weight of the secret like the bruise on her jaw that had long since faded, the kind of ache you forget about until something presses right on it. Over the weeks that followed, they developed what could only be called a courtship, though neither of them used the word. He came to see her on Sunday afternoons when she wasn't working, and they walked in the town or rode out toward his property, and they talked, endlessly, and with the ease of people who find talking to each other genuinely restful rather than effortful. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her mother who had kept chickens and a kitchen garden and made the best corn bread in Cooper County. He told her about his father's fiddle, which he still had though he couldn't play it, and about the first calf he'd pulled alone and thought he was going to lose and didn't. She did not tell him about Harlan. She told herself it was because the time wasn't right. Then she told herself it was because she needed to be sure of him first. Then, in February, when she woke up in the middle of the night and lay in the dark knowing with absolute honesty why she wasn't telling him, she admitted to herself that it was because she was afraid. Not afraid of Roscoe. Afraid of the look she might see on his face when he found out. Afraid of the word married applied to her in connection with another man. Afraid that a decent man's decency had limits that a woman with an absent husband and no legal standing would find very quickly. She was afraid, and she knew it, and in the morning she put her fear in its proper place and went to work. The letter arrived in early March. It came addressed to Louise Greer, care of Hatch's Mercantile, Colton Creek, Texas, and Emmett Hatch handed it to her with a look of gentle confusion, because he had not known her last name was Greer and everyone else in town knew her as Wallace. She took the letter with steady hands and went to the back room and stood by the window and opened it. It was from Harlan. He had a handwriting that was neat and slightly too formal, the handwriting of someone who had learned it as a performance rather than a skill. She had seen that handwriting in 4 letters over 7 years, each one finding her eventually because Harlan was patient and methodical and had money enough to hire people who were good at finding women who did not want to be found. The letter was short. He was in San Antonio. He had heard she was somewhere in the hill country. He was coming to retrieve his wife. He said the word retrieve the way you say it about property. He said that he hoped she would see reason this time and not create a scene, because a scene would be embarrassing for both of them, but particularly for her, given that the law was on his side. He was right about the law. That was the particular horror of it. Louise stood in the back room of the mercantile for 3 minutes. Then she folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and went back out to the counter and helped the next customer with their flour order, because there was nothing else to do. That evening she told Roscoe. She had not planned to do it that way. She had half planned to pack her bags that same night, to be gone before Harlan arrived, to protect Roscoe from being tangled in something ugly and legally complicated. She had saddled nobodies in her mind a dozen times already by the time she heard his boots on the boarding house porch, because he'd ridden in that afternoon to see her, as he sometimes did on Thursdays, and Mrs. Potts had sent him to the parlor. She sat across from him in Mrs. Potts's good parlor with its worn horsehair settee and its lamp turning gold in the corner, and she looked at the man she had spent 3 months being very careful about and told him all of it. She told him about Harlan Greer. She told him about marrying at 19, about the early months that had seemed ordinary enough before they weren't, about the way a man can demonstrate his character in increments so small you hardly notice each one, until you look up one day and find yourself somewhere you never agreed to be. She told him about the first lawyer and the second lawyer, and what the second lawyer had done. She told him about 11 towns in 7 years and the knife under her pillow. She told him about the letter in her coat pocket, the one that said Harlan was coming. She told him all of it in a flat, clear voice, without crying, because she had cried about it a sufficient number of times in private that she no longer needed to do it in front of people. And when she finished, she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the lamp and waited. Roscoe was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of being at a loss, the quiet of thinking. "How long do you think you have before he gets here?" he said. She blinked. Of all the responses she'd been steeling herself against, that was not one of them. "A week," she said. "Maybe 10 days if he's coming up from San Antonio by stage." "That's enough time," he said. "Enough time for what?" He looked at her with the gray-green eyes that changed with the light, and they were very steady now. "I know a man in Austin, a lawyer named Caldwell, who has handled cases like this. He's got some standing with the state court and he knows the right judges. I've met him twice on business matters. He's a good man and he knows his business." She stared at him. "Roscoe, I'm going to ride to Austin," he said, "and I'm going to ask Caldwell what we need to do. There are grounds for dissolution that maybe the first lawyers you found didn't know how to argue or didn't want to argue. Desertion, if it can be framed that way. Conduct unbecoming. There are judges in Texas who take a different view than Kansas courts, and Caldwell knows which ones. That will take more than 10 days. Some of it will, but if Caldwell files the right papers, it creates a legal process that even Harlan Greer can't simply ride over. It buys time. It makes him have to show up in court instead of just showing up in your doorway." She was quiet for a long moment. She was trying to see the angle of what he was offering, not the practical angle, but the personal one, what it cost him, what he wanted in return. "Why?" she asked. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. "Because I have been working up to telling you that I love you," he said, with the directness of a man who has decided on a thing. "And I would like to do that under circumstances where you are actually free to hear it and respond to it honestly, rather than under circumstances where you might feel obligated to me for helping you. So I am telling you now, before I do anything, what my personal situation is. I love you. I have been in love with you since at least December, possibly earlier. That's the truth, and you can do whatever you want with it. My helping you has nothing to do with what you do with that information. Those are two separate things. Louise Wallace sat in Mrs. Potts's parlor in the lamplight and felt something happen in her chest that was far beyond the furniture-moving sensation of November. It was more like a wall she'd built brick by careful brick over 7 years, developing a fracture, not collapsing, not all at once, but letting light through in a way that couldn't be sealed back up. "You should know," she said carefully, because she was a careful person and she could not stop being one even now, "that I am not in a position to promise you anything. I don't know what a lawyer can do. I don't know how long it takes. I don't know what Harlan will do when he gets here, and he is not a man who backs down easily." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for a promise." "Then what are you asking for?" He thought about this. "Permission," he said, "to do something about this instead of nothing." She looked at him for a long time. The lamp hummed softly in its bracket on the wall. Somewhere in the boarding house, Mrs. Potts was moving around in the kitchen, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening, entirely indifferent to the fact that something enormous was happening in the parlor. "You have my permission," she said. He left for Austin the next morning at first light, and she went to work. The days while he was gone were some of the most peculiar of her life. She worked her regular hours at the mercantile. She ate breakfast and supper at Mrs. Potts's table. She slept in her room with the knife under her pillow and the window facing the back pasture. She answered Emmett Hatch's questions about the letter by saying it was old business being sorted out, which was true enough. She answered Mrs. Potts's gentle, unasked questions by coming to breakfast looking composed and leaving the table before she could be drawn into a conversation. She thought about what Roscoe had said in the parlor. She thought about it the way she thought about things she had put in a secure place for later, not obsessively, but regularly, with the kind of attention you give to something you don't want to damage by handling it too much. He said he loved her. He had said it plainly and specifically, and he had not made it a condition of anything. That was not how men had spoken to her in the past. That was not even how men had spoken to women she'd known. The language of love in her experience had always been wrapped around expectation, around the implicit bargain of it, around what a man meant when he said it versus what a woman heard. Roscoe Shepard had said it like a statement of fact that he'd verified thoroughly and was reporting accurately, without requiring her to do anything with it in return. She thought, for the first time in a long time, about what she actually wanted. Not what was safe, not what was possible, what she wanted. She wanted to stop running. She wanted the knife to stay under the pillow because she'd chosen to keep it there and not because she needed it. She wanted to wake up in the morning in the same place she'd been the morning before, and the morning before that. She wanted to finish what she'd started, the accounts at the mercantile, the relationship with Colton Creek that had been growing roots she could feel in the dark of every night she spent in her room above the back pasture. She wanted Roscoe Shepard. She had wanted him since December, and she was done pretending otherwise, at least to herself. He came back on the 6th day. She was at the mercantile counter when she heard Senator's particular trot on the road outside. Senator had a slightly uneven rhythm to his gait that she'd learned to recognize, and she looked up, and Roscoe was tying the mule at the post and coming inside with a leather satchel and a look on his face that was careful and hopeful in equal measure. "Caldwell is filing papers with the Hayes County Court," he said, before she could speak. "Grounds of abandonment and conduct prejudicial to the marriage. He says the judge in Hayes County has seen cases like this, and he's not unsympathetic to the wife's position. It won't be instant, but it will be official, and once the papers are filed, Harlan Greer cannot legally remove you anywhere without being in contempt of an active court proceeding." Louise put both hands flat on the counter because she needed something to hold on to. "How long will the proceedings take?" she asked. "Caldwell thinks 4 to 6 months. Maybe less, depending on whether Harlan decides to contest it in the Texas court, which would put him in a complicated position because he'd be establishing himself in a Texas jurisdiction when he lives in Kansas. He won't want that," she said slowly. "Harlan doesn't like complications he can't control." That's what Caldwell thought too. Roscoe set the satchel on the counter. "There are copies of everything in here for you, your name, your terms, all of it. Caldwell said to tell you that you are his client, not me, and you can contact him directly if you want to make any changes." She looked at the satchel. She looked at Roscoe. "You paid for this," she said. "I did. I'm going to pay you back." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said firmly. "That is why I'm choosing to." "Do not make this into something I have to argue with you about, Roscoe." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She opened the satchel and read every page of what Caldwell had prepared, right there at the counter with the afternoon customers coming and going around her, and when she was done she closed it carefully and looked up. "It's good," she said. "It's well done. He's a good lawyer. Will you write to him and tell him to proceed? With my authorization, obviously. I'll sign whatever he needs. I already told him you'd want to see it first and he's expecting word from me." She nodded. She felt calm in a way that was different from the forced calm she'd maintained for years. Not the calm of suppression, but something more like clarity. Harlan Greer arrived in Colton Creek on a Tuesday. She knew he was there before she saw him, the way you know a weather change before the sky shows it, some shift in the quality of the air, some sixth sense honed by years of listening for footsteps. She was in the mercantile when she looked up and saw him through the front window, standing in the road, talking to someone she didn't recognize. He looked exactly the same as he had 7 years ago, which was somehow more disturbing than if he'd changed. Same build, same posture, same way of holding himself as if the space around him were already his. Emmett Hatch looked up from the back and clocked the tension in her face immediately. "Louise, what is it?" "A man I've been expecting," she said. "I need you to stay at your counter. Whatever happens, stay there and stay calm." "Should I stay at your counter, Emmett?" Harlan came through the door. He was 40 years old, brown-haired, well-dressed for a long journey, and he looked at her with the particular expression she had spent years in the back of her mind preparing for, not angry, not triumphant, just certain. The certainty of a man who had never believed anything had actually changed. "Louise," he said. "It's time to come home." "Harlan," she said, and her voice was even and it cost her something to keep it that way. "I'm at work. Whatever you have to say, you can say it briefly, and then I'd like you to leave this establishment." "There's nothing brief about it," he said. He moved toward the counter. "We've been through this. The law has been contacted," she said. "I have legal representation, and there are active court proceedings in Hays County, Texas, regarding the dissolution of our marriage. If you interfere with me in any way while those proceedings are active, you will be in contempt of a Texas court. If you'd like to speak to my lawyer, his name is Caldwell and he is in Austin." Harlan stopped. Something shifted in his face, not defeat, not yet, but the recalibration of a plan that had just encountered an unexpected obstacle. "You don't have standing to file for dissolution," he said, "not on whatever grounds you think you have." "The court will decide that," she said. "The papers are already filed. That is how the law works." The door behind Harlan opened and Roscoe Shepard came in. He did not come in dramatically. He came in the way he did everything, without display, with complete purpose. He stepped up beside Louise on her side of the counter and stood there, and the physical reality of him, the quiet and genuine solidity of him, was more eloquent than anything he might have said. Harlan looked at him. "And who are you?" "Roscoe Shepard," Roscoe said. "I have property east of town, and I know most of the people in this county by name, including Judge Alderman, who handles cases coming out of Hays County when they need a venue. I'm not your concern unless you make yourself my concern." There was a long silence. Harlan looked from Roscoe to Louise. She met his eyes without looking away, and what she showed him was not defiance exactly. Defiance has heat in it, and what she felt was colder and more certain than defiance. What she showed him was a woman who had made a decision and was prepared to stand in it. "You'll regret this, Louise," he said. "I've had 7 years to consider regret," she said. "I know what I regret and what I don't. You should go." He went. Not gracefully, not without the promise in his bearing that this wasn't finished, but he went, and the door closed behind him, and Emmett Hatch breathed loudly from the back room, and Louise put her hands in her lap under the counter and let them shake for a moment where nobody could see. "Are you all right?" Roscoe asked. Yes, she said, better than I expected. He won't give up immediately. No, she agreed, but he'll have to decide whether he wants to fight a Texas court proceeding. He has business in Kansas, and he doesn't like being away from it. He's patient, but he's not patient enough to sit in Texas for 4 months fighting a hearing. She was right about that, though it took another 2 weeks to play out. Harlan stayed in town. She saw him twice more, both times at a distance, and both times he looked at her with the calculating expression of a man running numbers on a situation. She went to Roscoe's place twice during those 2 weeks, and they sat in the kitchen of his farmhouse with coffee and Felix's company, and talked through everything that might happen and what it would mean. And those evenings were among the most sustained hours of peace she'd felt in a decade. His farmhouse was simple and well kept, a long kitchen that also served as a sitting room, 2 bedrooms, a covered porch on the south side that faced the creek and caught the afternoon sun. He had books, which she hadn't expected, and which made her reconsider everything she'd already thought she understood about him, because the books were not decorative. They were read. They had notes in the margins in the same handwriting that appeared on his supply orders, careful, slightly angular, never showing off. On the second visit, while Felix was outside and the winter dark had come down early over the creek, she said the thing she'd been deciding whether to say. "I want to tell you what I said to you in the parlor wasn't a complete answer," she said. "What I gave you was permission to help me. I didn't tell you how I felt about you." Roscoe set his coffee cup down. He looked at her. "I love you," she said. "I have for some months. I've been trying not to because my situation didn't seem to allow it, but it appears to be the kind of feeling that doesn't wait for situations to be convenient." She paused. "I wanted to tell you that now, before the proceedings are finished, so that you know it's not gratitude. It was there before you did anything." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that had something rough and honest in it that she hadn't heard from him before, "I know. I've known for a while." "Then why didn't you say anything?" "Because I needed to be sure you'd believe it wasn't about gratitude," he said. "So I was waiting for you to say it first." She looked at him across the kitchen table in his farmhouse, with the lamplight warm between them and the creek invisible in the dark outside the window. And she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and genuine, the kind she'd been stingy with for so many years that it surprised her when it came out that way, free and uncalculated. "You are a very particular kind of man," she said. "I've been told," he said. "It was a compliment." "I know," he said, and he was smiling too, and it was the most comfortable moment she could remember in a very long time. Harlan Greer left Colton Creek on a Thursday in late March. She found out from Emmett Hatch, who had heard from the livery owner, who had seen Harlan load his bags into the morning stage heading south toward San Antonio. She had expected to feel relief, and she did. But what she hadn't expected was that the relief had a different quality than what she'd been carrying for 7 years. It wasn't the gasping relief of a close escape. It was the quieter, more substantial relief of a process working the way it was supposed to. She wrote to Caldwell herself that same day, and he wrote back within the week to confirm that Harlan had not filed any counterpetition with the Texas court, which meant the proceedings would continue unopposed, and he expected a resolution within 3 months, possibly sooner. April came to the hill country with wildflowers and warm evenings, and the particular quality of Texas spring that seems to belong to everyone equally, free and extravagant. Louise's work at the mercantile had expanded because Emmett Hatch had started letting her manage the ordering as well as the accounts, which meant she was effectively running the business side of the store. And the business was doing better than it had in years because she had a talent for knowing what people needed before they knew it themselves. She spent her Sunday afternoons at Roscoe's place. This was not a secret. In a town the size of Colton Creek, nothing was a secret, and she had stopped trying to manage what people thought about it because she had enough to manage without adding other people's opinions. Mrs. Potts had said nothing explicit, but had begun putting fresh flowers on Louise's windowsill on Saturday evenings, which Louise chose to interpret as encouragement. Those Sunday afternoons on the Creeley Creek property were the happiest hours of her adult life. She said that to Roscoe one evening in May, sitting on the south porch while the last of the day's light lay gold along the top of the grass in the north pasture, and he said he felt the same way, and there was a quality to the admission between them, not romantic in the theatrical sense, but in the deeper sense, the sense of two people who have found something that actually fits and are not going to waste it. He kissed her the first time in late April, at the end of one of those Sunday afternoons, on the porch in the late light, with Senator watching from the paddock with his usual air of philosophical detachment. It was not a complicated kiss. It was a simple, unhurried thing that had been decided on by both of them well in advance, and it held the quality of something that had been coming from a long way off and had finally arrived. She pressed her hand against his chest for a moment and felt his heartbeat, which was steady and real, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost painful, this is what it should feel like. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I want you to know that. Whatever the court decides, I'm not going to run again." "I know," he said. "You can't know that," she said. "I have a history of leaving." "You have a history of surviving," he said. "That's different." She looked at him for a moment. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Say the thing that makes the most sense every time." He considered this. "I say a lot of things that don't make sense. You just don't hear those because they happen when you're not around." She laughed and leaned her forehead against his shoulder for a moment, and his arm came around her in a way that was completely without possession, steady and warm, and entirely voluntary on both sides. The letter from Caldwell arrived on a Wednesday in mid-June. The Hayes County Court had granted the dissolution of the marriage between Louise Greer and Harlan Greer on the grounds of abandonment and conduct contrary to the welfare of the spouse. The marriage was legally ended. Harlan had not appeared or filed any response. The court's decision was final and recorded. Louise read the letter at the mercantile counter, alone in the store during the lunch hour when Emmett was next door at the dusty spur having his midday meal. She read it twice. She put it down. She picked it up and read it again. Then she sat down on the stool behind the counter and put her face in her hands, not because she was sad, but because she needed somewhere private to feel the full size of what had just happened, and the only private place was the space behind her own palms. She had been Louise Greer for 7 years and Louise Wallace for 7 years simultaneously, and now she was only Louise Wallace, and the difference was so enormous and so simple that she needed a minute to contain it. She cried for exactly that minute, then she wiped her face, stood up, and went to find Roscoe. He was at the livery picking up a repaired piece of harness, and she found him in the yard by the stable and handed him the letter without preamble. He read it, and then he looked at her, and whatever he saw in her face made him step forward and take both her hands in his. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm just Louise Wallace. That's all I am." "That's a great deal," he said, and the look on his face was gentle and fierce at once, the look of someone who understood the weight of what he was saying. She squeezed his hands. She did not let go for a long time. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday evening in July on the south porch of the farmhouse, with the creek running warm and low below them and the fireflies beginning to move in the tall grass of the pasture. He did not make a speech. He said her name, and then he said, "I'd like to spend the rest of my life with you. I'd like to build something here with you. Will you marry me?" She looked at the property she had come to love, the north pasture, and the stand of live oak, and the creek, and the lopsided hill, and the house that was simple and well kept, and full of red books with notes in the margins. And she looked at this man who had stood beside her in a mercantile, and said 2 words to someone who needed to move, and who had ridden to Austin before she'd even had a chance to tell him she loved him, and who had waited for her to say it first so she'd know it wasn't gratitude. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He put a ring on her finger, a plain gold band he'd had made in San Antonio, no stone, just clean and simple and real. And she held her hand up and looked at it in the last of the July light and felt, with absolute conviction, that this was the first ring that had ever been given to her rather than placed on her in the manner of a transaction. They were married in September, at the Colton Creek Church with the cracked bell, which nonetheless rang clearly enough to carry across the whole town when Emmett Hatch pulled the rope. The whole town came, because in a place like Colton Creek, everyone knew everything and had opinions about everyone, and the prevailing opinion was that Roscoe Shepard had finally gotten around to doing something right for himself, and Louise Wallace was entirely worthy of the occasion. Mrs. Potts sat in the front pew and cried without embarrassment. Felix Oropsa stood up for Roscoe and gave a toast at the small dinner afterward that was brief and genuine. He is the most patient man I have known, and she was worth every day of it. Louise stood in the church in a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself over the course of 2 months with Mrs. Potts's help, and when Roscoe turned to look at her as she came down the aisle, the expression on his face was not the theatrical awe of men in stories but something quieter and more specific, the look of someone who had hoped for something and was now watching it actually happen, and finding it better than the hope. They said the words. They meant them. That first winter of marriage, they worked the property together through the cold months. She took over the accounts and the record-keeping for the ranch with the same thoroughness she'd brought to the mercantile, and Roscoe watched her with the look of someone who has been handed something he didn't know he needed and finds himself wonderfully at a loss. She continued 3 days a week at Hatch's mercantile because she liked the work and she liked Emmett, and because Roscoe did not once suggest that she stop, which she found deeply, quietly important. In the evenings they sat in the farmhouse kitchen with books and coffee, and the comfortable silence of 2 people who do not need to fill every moment with sound to believe that they are together. Sometimes he read to her from the books with the margin notes, and his voice in the lamplight with the creek audible outside if the night was quiet enough was the most ordinary and extraordinary thing she had ever experienced in her life. She learned to play 3 simple chords on his father's fiddle, which he claimed was 4 more than he'd ever managed, and she took that as evidence that she was at least ahead on something. In the spring of 1885, she found out she was expecting. She told him on a Tuesday morning before he went out to check the north pasture, across the kitchen table with coffee between them and the early April light coming through the window. She said it plainly because she was a plain-speaking person. "I'm expecting," she said. "I think around October." He looked at her. The expression that moved across his face was complex and layered, an entirely unguarded surprise first, then something that cracked open in him like ground in spring, something that was not just happiness but the specific emotion of a man who had not been certain he deserved this and was finding out, all at once, that it had arrived anyway. He put his hand over hers on the table. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling fine," she said. "I've been feeling tired, but I think that's normal." "Yes," he said, and then almost to himself, "Yes." "Are you pleased?" she asked, though she already knew. She just wanted to hear him say it. "I am," he said. "I'm very pleased." He paused. "I'm terrified." "Of what?" "Of doing it wrong," he said honestly. "Of not being what I should be." "You're already what you should be," she said. "You've been practicing for years." He turned her hand over and held it properly, and looked at her with the gray-green eyes that she had been reading for 2 years now and that still showed her new things regularly. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you too." He was late getting to the north pasture that morning, and Felix told her later with enormous satisfaction that Roscoe had told him the news before he told anyone else, and then stood there looking at the fence line with the expression of a man hearing music. The pregnancy that year was healthy and uncomplicated. Louise continued working at the mercantile until August, when the heat and the state of things made the walk into town more effort than it was worth, and she managed the ranch accounts from home without breaking stride. Roscoe was attentive without being smothering, which she had not been certain was possible in a man, but which he managed by applying to fatherhood the same quality he applied to everything: thorough care without the need for display. He built a small additional room off the main bedroom, with Felix's help, working evenings and weekends through the summer, and she watched them work from the kitchen window and felt a happiness so complete and uncomplicated that it sometimes frightened her, because she'd spent so long operating without it that she wasn't entirely sure how to hold it. She said something like that to Mrs. Potts one afternoon in August, over the tea she'd come to associate with every important conversation of her Colton Creek life. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," she said. "I keep looking over my shoulder." Mrs. Potts set her cup down and looked at her with the clear, experienced eyes that had seen a great deal of life. "That will take a while to stop," she said. "You built that habit over years, and it doesn't go away because the reason for it is gone. But here is what I will tell you, Louise. Looking over your shoulder from a place of safety is not the same as looking over it from a place of fear. The motion is the same. The feeling is different." Louise thought about that for a long time after. It was right. It was precisely right. On the 14th of October, 1885, in the bedroom of the farmhouse on Creeley Creek, with the help of Mrs. Potts and the town's doctor, she delivered a son. He was red-faced and loudly opinionated from his first moments, which she found appropriate, and he had Roscoe's eyes, even in those first hours, that gray-green that shifts with the light. They named him Henry Wallace Shepard, Henry for Roscoe's father and Wallace for Louise's family name, the name she'd kept secret and safe for 7 years and could now give away freely, which seemed like the right use for it. When Roscoe held Henry for the first time standing by the window with the October afternoon light coming in sideways over the creek, Louise watched his face and thought about the expression she'd seen on it at the church, and the expression she'd seen at the kitchen table in April, and this expression was different from both of those. This was a man meeting something so specific and so entirely his own that there were no words prepared for it, and he'd stopped trying to find any and was simply standing there in it. He looked at her over Henry's head, and she looked back at him. "Hello, Henry," Roscoe said softly to the child. "We've been waiting for you." Felix came to see Henry the next morning with a carved wooden horse that he'd been working on for 2 months, which he presented with the gravity of a formal gift, and then broke entirely by making faces at the baby until Henry made a face back. "He is already unimpressed by everything," Felix said with delight. "He gets this from Louise." "He gets it from both of them," Mrs. Potts said from the doorway. The winter of Henry's first year was different from any winter Louise had known before. Not easier, exactly. A baby made everything more complicated in practical terms, but fuller, in the way that something of real substance is heavier than something hollow. The farmhouse on Creeley Creek felt inhabited in a new way, warm in a way that had nothing to do with the wood stove, full of the small noises and movements of a life being actively lived. She nursed Henry and managed the ranch accounts and read in the evenings when he slept and lay awake some nights, not from fear, but from the simple, persistent wonder of where she was and how she'd gotten here from there. She thought about the girl she'd been at 19, married in Kansas Spring, not knowing yet what the years ahead held. She did not feel sorry for that girl in a simple way. Sorry was too small. She felt a kind of tender, complicated regard for her, the way you feel about someone who went through something hard and came out somewhere they couldn't have imagined. Colton Creek grew around them in the years that followed, small and incremental as most real growth is. The church got its bell repaired properly. The mercantile expanded into the building next door when Emmett Hatch's business grew large enough to need it. A school was established in a converted house on the north end of the main road, which Louise helped to advocate for by writing 2 extremely well-reasoned letters to the county board, and which Roscoe helped to build by putting up 3 solid days of labor on the framing with a dozen other men from the surrounding area. The ranch prospered. Roscoe put up fencing that held, ran cattle that didn't stray, paid his hands every month on time. Senator the Mule lived to an improbable age and maintained his philosophical disposition throughout. Nobody's, Louise's clay-colored mare, eventually retired to a comfortable existence of light work and daily grooming, and served primarily as Henry's first lesson in respecting an animal's character. Henry grew into a boy who was quiet and watchful in the way of his father, with his mother's precision, and his mother's way of seeing through to the actual nature of things. He followed Roscoe around the property from the time he could walk, asking questions with a thoroughness that made Felix describe him as a person who would grow up either to be a lawyer or a very good farmer, possibly both. Louise told Henry about Missouri when he was old enough to understand, about his grandmother's corn bread and the kitchen garden, and the name sewn into the Sunday dress collar. She did not tell him everything about the 7 years between Missouri and Colton Creek. Not yet, because there was time for that, and the full weight of it was not something a young child could carry. But she told him enough so that he knew where he came from, and what it meant that she had chosen where she was. In the autumn of 1887, Louise found out she was expecting again. She told Roscoe the same way she'd told him the first time across the kitchen table before he went out to the pasture with coffee between them. He put his hand over hers and smiled at her in the morning light, and it was a smile that had years in it now, years of mornings and evenings and the small daily accumulation of a life shared. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired," she said, "and very well." This time in the spring of 1888 they had a daughter. They named her Clara, for Mrs. Potts, who sat in the kitchen that evening after the birth and wept without apology and called it the finest honor of her life. Clara was born opinionated and remained so. By the time she was 2 years old, she had worked out that if she got to the barn before Henry and asked Felix a question first, Felix would let her name the next foal, and she had named 3 horses, a cat, and 1 very confused chicken in this fashion. Louise watched her daughter maneuver the world with the amused recognition of someone who saw themselves clearly in another person for the first time. "She got that from you," Roscoe said one evening, watching Clara conduct an elaborate negotiation with Henry over ownership of a particular stick. "She got it honestly," Louise said. "The most polite way to say yes, she got it from you." She laughed and leaned against his shoulder on the porch, and he put his arm around her, and the evening came down over the creek and the pasture and the lopsided hill, and all the named landmarks of a place she had stopped running through and started living in. One evening in the spring of 1889, she found herself at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, looking at the account books for the ranch in the lamplight, and she stopped in the middle of a column of numbers and sat back and listened to the sounds of the house. Roscoe's boots on the porch, where he was checking that the latch on the paddock was secure before coming in. The creek running in the dark outside. Henry's breathing through the partially open door of his room. Clara making some small sound in her sleep that might have been a word or might have been nothing. She thought about the first morning she'd ridden into Colton Creek 43 cents, a fading bruise, a name kept secret like a coal in cupped hands. She thought about Mrs. Potts's sign, clean rooms, honest rates. She thought about a man in a road talking reason to a mule. 7 years she had spent running from a man who held her name in a piece of paper and called it ownership. And then a man had come along who also had a claim, not a legal one, not the kind that could be written down and filed with a court, but the kind of claim that 2 people make on each other when they choose each other clearly and honestly, the kind that has to be renewed every morning and is the better for it. He had that claim. He had always had that kind of claim, from the moment she'd stood in the mercantile doorway watching him apply logical argument to a mule with a patient and genuine respect for the animal's point of view. And he had never once used it the way a claim is used, as leverage, as ownership, as something owed. He had used it the only way it should be used. He had used it to stand beside her. The door opened and Roscoe came in from the porch, taking off his hat and hanging it on the nail by the door the way he always did, an action so familiar to her now that the absence of it in some future she didn't intend to think about would be a kind of loss she couldn't measure. He looked at her at the table and saw whatever was on her face, and came over and sat down across from her the way he had on 100 evenings. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. 7 years, she said. He waited. "I spent 7 years running from a man who thought a paper made me his," she said. "And I ended up here with a man who has every claim on me that actually matters and has never once made me feel it like a leash." Roscoe looked at her for a long moment. "It's not a claim," he said. "It's not the right word for it." "What is the right word?" He thought about it the way he thought about things, carefully, from the ground up, not borrowing a word that didn't fit. "Choice," he said. "Every day." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight of the kitchen that had become as familiar as her own face, with the creek running outside and their children sleeping and the ranch alive all around them in the spring dark. And she thought, yes, that is exactly right. That is the only word for it. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he held it with the steady warmth that she had come to understand was not a gesture or a performance, but simply the temperature of the man, reliably warm, regardless of the weather. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been saying that for years. I know, I believe it more every time." She smiled at him. He smiled back. Outside, the creek ran on in the dark toward wherever creeks go, and the fireflies were starting in the tall grass of the pasture, and the night was warm and full of the ordinary sounds of a life that had been chosen, carefully and at great cost, and was worth every mile of the cost. Mrs. Potts came for Sunday dinners most weeks, and in the summer of 1889 she announced at one of these dinners that she was considering selling the boarding house and taking a smaller place, because she was getting older, and the work of running rooms was becoming more than she wanted. Louise looked at Roscoe across the table, and he looked at her with one eyebrow slightly raised, which was his way of asking a question without asking it in front of company. "You could have the spare room here," Louise said to Mrs. Potts. "The house has the room, and frankly the children love you more than they love most people, and I will not pretend otherwise." Mrs. Potts put her fork down and looked at Louise over the rim of her reading spectacles with an expression that was trying to be composed and not managing it. "I would be in your way," she said. "You would be in my kitchen making corn bread," Louise said, "which is the opposite of being in my way." Mrs. Potts came to live with them in the autumn of 1889, in the room that had been the guest room and became hers in the way rooms do when someone inhabits them thoroughly enough. She brought 3 crates of things and a cat named Biscuit, whom Clara immediately claimed as her personal companion and senator regarded with deep suspicion from across the fence. The household that had been 2 and then 4 became 5, and the farmhouse on Creeley Creek held it all without strain, because Roscoe had built it well, which was how he built everything. Emmett Hatch eventually made Louise a full partner in the mercantile, not because she had asked for it, but because the books showed clearly that the business was different with her managing it, and Emmett was a man smart enough to recognize what he had and honest enough to make it official. She signed the papers in the spring of 1890 as Louise Wallace Shepard, and the signature was so much itself clear and clean and entirely present, that she kept the pen on her desk for a week afterward just to look at it. Felix stayed on at the ranch through all of it, and Darnell Pike stayed, and young Sam grew into a solid and dependable man in his mid-20s, who eventually bought a small property of his own not far east of the Shepard place, and came back to work the same hours he always had, which was all of them. The Creeley Creek country filled in around them gradually, as places do when they start to feel worth settling in. Henry, at 5, learned to name the ice formations on the creek in January, which he did with a thoroughness and a creative vocabulary that surpassed anything his parents had attempted. Roscoe took him out on that first cold morning of Henry's 5th year and stood with him on the bank the way he had once stood with Louise, and Henry crouched at the water's edge and studied the ice with the intense focus of someone taking the measure of something important. "It's different every year," Roscoe told him. "How do you know which one is the best?" Henry asked. "You don't," Roscoe said. "That's the point. Each year it's the best version of that year." Henry considered this with the look of someone filing away information for later review. Then he stood up and said, "Dad, Senator is watching us from the paddock, and he has the look he gets before he does something." They went back to manage Senator. Louise watched from the porch window, her coffee in both hands, Clara asleep in the room behind her, Mrs. Potts moving around in the kitchen with Biscuit winding around her ankles. And she thought about all the versions of January she had spent looking over her shoulder at nothing and no one but her own fear. And she thought about this January, which was the version of this year, and she did not look over her shoulder at all. There was a moment in the spring of 1891 when a stranger passing through Colton Creek asked who owned the Creeley Creek property, and Emmett Hatch, who happened to be standing nearby, said without hesitation, "Roscoe and Louise Shepard, fine people. Best operation in the county." Louise heard this from Emmett himself later that afternoon, with the slight air of someone reporting a thing they knew would land correctly. She smiled at her account books. Best operation in the county. She was going to write that down somewhere. That evening she told Roscoe, and he absorbed it with the moderate satisfaction of someone who had been quietly hoping to hear something like that for a long time but had not wanted to be the one to say it. "Felix will want credit," he said. "Felix deserves credit," she said. "Felix is going to be unbearable about it." "Felix is never unbearable," she said. "You are thinking of Senator." He looked at her with the gray-green eyes in the evening light, the eyes she had been reading for years and still found instructive, and they were full of the specific kind of happiness that comes from being exactly where you are supposed to be and knowing it. They sat together on the porch in the spring evening with the creek below them and the fireflies beginning, and the north pasture green and the live oaks casting long shadows east toward the lopsided hill, and they talked about nothing in particular. The fence line on the south boundary, whether Henry was ready for his first real responsibility with the cattle, what Mrs. Potts had said at dinner about the weather turning, small things, daily things, the texture of an actual life. And the conversation was easy and warm and entirely itself, not a stand-in for something else, not a performance, just two people who knew each other thoroughly and found each other's company genuinely restful. The cracked bell of the Colton Creek Church had been repaired that spring, and when it rang on Sunday mornings it carried all the way to the creek now, which Henry said sounded like the whole town waking up. Louise said that was a fine way to describe it. Roscoe said Henry had her way with words, and Henry said he thought he had both their ways, which was so accurate that nobody could argue with it. They lived out their years on the Creeley Creek property and in Colton Creek, and in the whole of that particular hill country that bloomed and dried and froze, and bloomed again in the reliable cycle of things that have decided to stay. Louise Wallace Shepard was a woman known in that county for clear accounts, fair dealing, an extraordinary handwriting, and a way of seeing through to what was actually true about a situation, which last quality her daughter Clara inherited completely, and her son Henry inherited about 60% of, which was 60% more than most people got. She was known as a woman who had come from somewhere difficult and made something real, which was the truest thing anyone could say about her, and she would not have argued with it. She had come to Colton Creek with 43 cents and a name she was keeping safe, and she had built something from those materials that she would not have traded for any version of a life that had not cost what this one cost, because the cost was the reason the thing was real. You do not get to keep something for free. You have to choose it and keep choosing it, and the choosing is the point. On a January morning in their 7th year on the Creeley Creek property, Louise walked down to the bank of the creek in the early cold with her coat buttoned to the throat, and stood where she had stood that first winter when Roscoe had brought her here and shown her the ice. The formations were different this year, longer, thinner, more angular, the particular best version of this year's winter, as Roscoe had explained to Henry. She heard his boots behind her on the frozen ground and did not have to look to know who it was. She knew his footfall on every surface in every weather. He stood beside her with several inches of air between them that they'd long since stopped keeping there, and his arm came around her shoulder and she leaned into the warmth of him, and they looked at the ice together in the morning quiet. "Still beautiful," she said. "Every winter," he said. "I still haven't gotten used to it." "I don't think you're supposed to," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't think so either." The creek ran quiet and dark between its banks, and the ice caught the morning light and held it, and Colton Creek behind them was beginning to wake up in the way it did smoke from chimneys, the distant sound of the church bell, Senator announcing something from the paddock with his usual sense of occasion. The whole ordinary, extraordinary morning of a life that was entirely and fully and permanently theirs. Louise Wallace Shepard stood at the creek in the January light and did not look over her shoulder, because there was nothing behind her any more except the way she had come, and she knew every inch of that road and had made her peace with it, and the only direction that mattered now was forward, which was warm and full and waiting for her just the same as every morning. She was home. She had been home for years. And she knew, with the clarity of someone who had been many places and understood the difference, that she was going to be home for the rest of her life, which was the greatest freedom she had ever known.